Thank the member. Recognize the member from New Westminster.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I am pleased to stand today to speak in support of Bill 9. I think we all know in this chamber, and I think people know right across British Columbia, of the horrific events that happened at Babine and Lakeman Mill explosions that cost 4 workers their lives, that injured 42 others. Perhaps one of the worst indictments of WorkSafe B.C. and of the lack of proper health and safety protections, the lack of sufficient health and safety, occupational health and safety inspections in this province. I rise to support this bill, Honourable Speaker, because it begins. It's a first step to fixing some of the systemic lapses in workplace safety that, frankly, and it must be said, were caused in part by a decade of neglect by this BC Liberal government of issues related to workplace health and safety. This bill, following up on the Macatee report released last year, takes some important steps forward to addressing some very, very grave concerns. The bill will provide a range of new safety enforcement tools. It will shorten the process for finalizing financial penalties to improve their effectiveness as an enforcement tool. It will ensure more timely employer investigations of workplace incidents and reports. It will enhance workplace safety expertise on the WorkSafe B.C. Board of Directors in the area of occupational health and safety and in the area of law and law enforcement. And those are certainly important steps forward. But let's be very clear why this issue is in front of us today. And let's be very clear that WorkSafe BC has one main job. It has one main job. It exists for the purposes of keeping workers safe. It exists to help ensure that workers are able to return to their families at night safe, whole, alive. The workers who worked in these mills, the families of the workers who worked in these mills. I've had the opportunity to meet with them. I know the minister has. People in both sides of this House have had the opportunity to meet with them. And they have said to me over and over again, you know, it wasn't a secret. It was known that dust in these mills was a hazard. Workers had gone to the employers. They'd raised these issues. It was known throughout the industry. And despite the fact that people were pointing to wood dust as a factor in the first mill fire, and were certainly speaking out in the days that followed it, the time before action was actually taken in mills across the province was far too long, Honourable Speaker, and then we were faced with another horrific mill fire that again killed workers, that again meant that workers would not be returning at night to their families and their loved ones. And this despite the fact, Honourable Speaker, that WorkSafe had received a briefing from a US expert in 2010, about the dangers of wood dust. The WorkSafe report that was issued a year ago found very clearly that sawdust was a factor in the explosion at Lakeland that killed Glenn Roche and Alan Little and left 14 others critically injured. And it also found that it was preventable. It was preventable. It also determined the same with the Babine explosion that killed Robert Luggy and Carl Charlie. Those deaths were preventable, Honourable Speaker. Those deaths were preventable. This bill moves us forward, unquestionably. It moves us forward. But we have an awful lot of moving forward to do, Honourable Speaker, it must be said. And it must be said, we have to look at the context in which these fires and these tragic deaths and these injuries that will scar workers physically and emotionally for life, the context in which they took place. And I think it is appropriate, and I will say it calmly, Honorable Speaker. It must be said that we've had a decade of action by this government that has contributed to workplaces across British Columbia becoming less safe for workers. Less safe for workers. As part of the BC Liberal government's deregulation exercise, WorkSafe B.C. was asked to cut health and safety regulations by a third. By a third, Honorable Speaker. WorkSafe B.C. exists to keep workers safe and for no other reason. Under the BC Liberals, WorkSafe B.C. made major cuts to its staff and to services. In 2002 alone, the budget of WorkSafe B.C. was reduced by 12%, a move that resulted in office closures and a 30% reduction in site visits by prevention officers. I know many of the people who work for WorkSafe B.C., they're not happy about this. They've wanted in the past decade to be able to do their jobs more effectively. But with those kinds of cuts, those kinds of staffing levels, it gets harder and harder. Under this government, WorkSafe B.C. drastically reduced inspection reports, down 45% just from 2002 to 2004, Honorable Speaker. Written orders down 49% in that two-year period. Employer penalties down 36% just in a two-year period. Also in 2002, when some of these more sweeping changes were made to workers' compensation, the government virtually eliminated virtually all loss of earnings pensions for permanently injured or ill workers were eliminated. And as a result, the annual number of loss of earnings pensions awarded dropped from 927 to only 39 in a few-year period. And the average value of those pensions was also reduced. Again, going back over a decade, but this is part of the context, Honorable Speaker, and we can't ignore it. We can't sweep it under the table. We can't refuse to recognize it or talk about it. In 2002, the government also made significant changes to the Workers' Compensation Act, which made it almost impossible for police officers or other emergency workers to access stress-related compensation. And many of the workers, the survivors of these mill fires, that's what they're living with. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which also affects many other occupations, like police, like firefighters, like ambulance paramedics. And Honorable Speaker, at the same time that the government made these cost-saving changes to reduce the amount of compensation paid to workers, they set employer premium rates that were at the lowest level in 30 years. At the lowest level, Honorable Speaker. Some of my colleagues who spoke to this bill earlier today asked the question, and I asked the question as well, as these workers, as the survivors of the mill fire did, as their families have, as working people across BC have. Why did these fires happen, Honorable Speaker? The answer is clear: because profits came before safety. Profits came before safety, and warnings were ignored. Warnings by some of the same workers who were severely injured in those fires. I've spoken with them. I've heard the stories of the people they went to and told about the hazards and said something needs to be done that were ignored. It is for all of us an incredibly moving experience to speak with some of these workers, to meet them personally, to meet with the widows to meet with family members of the workers who were killed or severely injured, injured physically, injured emotionally, for life. And I want to say in this House that these workers, these survivors, their widows, their children, their relatives, have shown remarkable courage over these last few years since they lost their loved ones. The workers who survived that fire live with memories that will never, ever go away. Never, ever go away of what happened that day when the workplace that they were accustomed to going to every day turned into a fireball, when they saw their co-workers incinerated, Honorable Speaker. Some of the workers who survived, some who were most severely injured, dragged as many of their co-workers to safety as they possibly could before they were overcome. And they suffered incredibly serious burns and trauma as a result. And Honorable Speaker, some of those workers, many of those workers, remain traumatized to this day. It also must be said that some of the workers who survived that fire with severe burns to most of their body and severe trauma, diagnosed as suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And sometimes, Honorable Speaker, we've heard those words so many times in recent years that sometimes maybe we've become inured to what they mean. But imagine how it scars the psyche, the well-being, the emotional health, not to mention the physical health of these workers to have experienced what they did. And yet, some of those workers suffering today from PTSD have, in the intervening time since the fire, actually been victimized again. Some have been followed, some have been videotaped, and Honorable Speaker, it's wrong. It's wrong. They were victimized. They were victimized so severely in that fire. Their families were, and some of them continue to be victimized as they fight for justice today. But despite that, Honorable Speaker, despite that, these same workers stand up and speak out and travel the province and attend the inquest and give their heart and their soul to get justice, not just for themselves, but also, Honorable Speaker, to do everything in their power to ensure that what happened to them and their co-workers who died doesn't ever happen again. And despite the unspeakable grief experienced by wives and family members, daughters, sons, sisters, brothers, despite the unspeakable grief and horror that they live with, because they have learned so much about exactly what happened to their loved ones, and they are learning more all the time, despite them living with the horror of what happened to their loved ones, they continue to have the courage to speak out for justice. And so should we. We owe it to them. We owe it to those workers who lost their lives. We owe it to those workers who've been injured for life. We owe it to the families whose husbands and fathers and sisters and brothers didn't come home at night. Those families are still seeking justice, Honorable Speaker. They are still seeking a public inquiry in order to finally, decisively get to the bottom of what happened and why. And they've said to me, As I'm sure they've said to the minister, and as I know they've said to many people in this house, nothing will ever bring back their loved ones. Nothing will ever fill that hole in their lives. But knowing what happened, a public inquiry that digs deep, Honorable Speaker, that digs deep, that can ask every question, that can call any witness, that can truly get to the bottom of why these horrific fires happened and why these workers were injured and killed. They deserve justice, and they don't have it yet, Honorable Speaker. So in conclusion, let me say that this bill is a step forward, and I will certainly be voting for it, as I know my colleagues on this side of the House will. But I will also say that these workers and their families deserve much, much, much more. They deserve better than this. Workers across British Columbia deserve better than this, Honorable Speaker. Too many workers still go to work every day and are often forced through pressures of various sorts to make unacceptable choices about whether they're going to keep their job, stay on the job, or come home safe and whole. Workers make those unacceptable choices every day. And families, Honorable Speaker, have the right to know that their loved ones will return to their families whole, safe, alive. So I will be supporting this bill, but I think we should all say in this House, on both sides of this House, that this bill is the beginning. It's not the end. It's the beginning. And I would hope that everyone in this House would join together in a solemn commitment to the workers from Lakeland and Babine, join together in a solemn commitment to the families and the survivors of those workers, that we will stand with them. We will stand with them as they continue to seek justice. These workers are calling for an independent review. Their family members are calling for an independent review. Right across this province, Honorable Speaker, workers and the organizations, the unions that represent them, are calling for an independent review. Let's support that call. The memory of these workers deserves no less.